Welcome to day 165 on the trail. We have three readings for today from 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 1 through 11 verse 1, Judges chapter 1 verse 1 through 2:23, and 2 Maccabees chapter 4 verses 7 through 22. Today, we open the book of Judges, which picks up where Joshua leaves off. However, the stories contained within the book of Judges will reverse the trend that we saw in the book of Joshua. As Judges opens, we find the people turning away from God instead of following God. The first problem that leads to this tragic reversal, as recorded in chapters 1 and 2, are that the people living in the Promised Land initially were not driven out as commanded by God. As a result, the people of Israel become ensnared by the religious practices of their neighbors. Beginning in Judges chapter 2, verse 1. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my commandment with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you. Beginning in chapter 2, a pattern develops that is seen throughout the rest of the book. The people break their covenant with God, and they suffer the consequences for their actions. Yet God in His mercy raises up a judge to rescue them from their oppressors. As long as the judge is alive, the people remain faithful to God. However, as soon as the judge dies, the people regress, and the cycle repeats. The Hebrew word shofet is traditionally translated judge. However, the meaning is actually closer to deliverer than our modern definition of a judge. A shofet is endowed by the Spirit of God, who brings deliverance to God's people. One of the major themes in Judges is the two ways, which we have discussed earlier along the trail. One way leads to life, and the other toward destruction. Either we are actively moving toward God and growing in our relationship with Him, or we are moving away. There is no place to stand still, no fence upon which to sit. Now, one of the people groups that will be mentioned repeatedly throughout the book of Judges are the Philistines. The origin and background of the Philistines is not completely clear. Ancient Egyptian records describe a significant influx of people known as the Sea Peoples, who invade Egypt around 1188 BC. They made land and sea incursions, engaging in battles against the forces of Ramses III. According to Egyptian records, Ramses III emerged victorious in these conflicts. Also, the Sea Peoples journeyed eastward from the region of the Aegean and waged war against the Hittites in Anatolia and cities in northern Syria such as Ugarit. I would like to comment briefly on a passage from 2 Maccabees chapter 4 regarding the actions of Jason. Jason was the brother of Onias and also obtained the role of high priest through corruption. In 2 Maccabees chapter 4 verse 12, he took delight in establishing a gymnasium right under the citadel, and he induced the noblest of the young men to wear the Greek hat. There was such an extreme of Hellenization and increase in the adoption of foreign ways because of the suppressing wickedness of Jason, who was ungodly and no true high priest, that the priests were no longer intent upon their service at the altar. Despising the sanctuary and neglecting the sacrifices, they hurried to take part in the unlawful proceedings in the wrestling arena after the signal for the discus throwing, disdaining the honors prized by their ancestors and putting the highest value upon Greek forms of prestige. Jason begins to introduce Greek practices into the heart of Jerusalem, focused specifically on the youth, the next generation. Jason's goal was to shift the hearts and minds of the Jewish people away from their traditions, cultural practices, and the worship of God, and toward foreign culture and the religion of Hellenism. This practice of cultural assimilation and religious syncretism would weaken and even destroy Jewish identity for future generations. Today, some are critical of traditions or cultural practices that may seem rote or outdated. However, as long as those traditions are accountable to Jesus and his kingdom, Christian traditions and practices help reinforce our identity as followers of Jesus and can bind us together as a community. Conversely, when we allow our Christian traditions and practices to drift or to become assimilated into the culture and moral practices of the larger world, we can quickly lose our identity and our distinctiveness as members of God's kingdom. Turning now to the New Testament and 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Here, Paul provides examples from Israel's wanderings in the desert of Sinai during the Exodus experience. After leaving Egypt, God had blessed Israel by caring for their needs in the wilderness and giving to them his instructions and commandments. However, despite God's graciousness, Israel complained repeatedly against God and failed to trust him completely. Therefore, the first generation who left Egypt fell in the wilderness, with only Joshua and Caleb reaching the promised land. In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul encourages the Christians in Corinth to learn from Israel's experience during their desert sojourn. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6 and verse 11, Paul writes, "Now these things occurred as examples for us, so that we might not desire evil as they did. And these things happened to them to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us, on whom the ends of the ages have come." Despite God's gracious gifts, Israel did not live faithfully or appropriately to their calling and identity. And the Christians living in Corinth were in danger of doing the same thing. These warnings from Paul applied both to those whom Paul called the strong and those he called the weak. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning in verse 12, "So if you think you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide the way out, so that you may be able to endure it." At the end of chapter 10, Paul then returns to the topic of idolatry. Although, as Paul previously stated in chapter 8, idols themselves are empty. And as he said in verse 4, no idol in the world really exists. So Paul now tells the Corinthians in chapter 10, verse 14, "Therefore, my dear friends, flee from the worship of idols." The danger here is that the bodily participation in the practice of idolatry or the worship of idols in their culture can lead to spiritual entanglements. To support his instructions here, Paul makes reference to the Eucharist or communion. As the celebration of communion involves participation in the body and blood of Jesus in the bread and the cup, so eating food at the table of idols can involve participation in spiritual forces and even an unwitting partnership with demons. As Paul writes in verse 21, "You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake in the table of the Lord and the table of demons." While the idols may not be real, the spiritual distortion of idolatry, the choice to honor and give thanks to something other than God, is real and incredibly dangerous. So Paul closes this extended discussion with an overarching directive. In verse 31, "Whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. And in the end, this becomes a simple statement of our underlying motivation as Christians. We are to seek the glory of God and not ourselves. And this is clearly shown in our daily lives by seeking the good of others rather than ourselves. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.